Hello, everyone. How's everyone doing? Yeah, kind of middling. I mean, this is quite exciting for me. The last time I was in St. George's Hall with a microphone was about 10 years ago, and I was playing keyboards in a courtroom concert. They've got the old courtrooms that they sometimes use for events, so that's my claim to fame for being here. But I'm very excited to be here. It's very, very nice to be asked. And yet, I'm looking very much at the idea of values and principles and that sort of thing. So I'm not going to be talking about kind of Figma and component libraries and getting too far into service design blueprints and all of that kind of thing. It's more thinking about the kind of the values and principles that you can bring into your teams and design thinking and that sort of thing. And very much kind of thinking, how can you kind of think in this kind of quite global way in terms of big values and concepts, but then kind of make it tangible in terms of local services. And hopefully I'm going to give you a bit of a context into what's going on in Liverpool at the moment and, you know, kind of where you are today and everything like that. If this works. Here we go. So I think this is probably covered in my little intro, but I'm Greg Macoy, the Chief Operating Officer of Matchstick Creative, and we're a purpose-driven creative agency and consultancy, and we work cross sectors, so it's kind of public sector, private businesses, community organizations, but very much on the idea of kind of purpose-driven business projects and what we can do to try and sort of help move the conversation along. I started out in web and digital like over 20 years ago, clearly showing my age very much there. Morphed into a sort of user experience lead. So at uni, my background was in kind of electrical engineering, human factors, and that sort of side of things. So I've always been interested in kind of the people involved in all of this. And then for the past sort of 6 or so years, Ruth and I have been leading Matchstick Creative in purpose, brand, comms, that sort of side of things, and more into the idea of kind of what business transformation can look like with kind of purpose at its core if you're moving beyond, you know, just purely profit and that sort of idea. So I'll jump in. As I say, we're kind of cross-sector, so NHS, local authorities, universities, private businesses, community organizations, and that sort of thing. So quite, you know, we're quite proud of our client list and the work that they do. So the nub of what I'm talking about today, really, there's a big world out there. This is obviously quite an awesome landscape to be kind of part of. The flip side of that is it can be overwhelming, and if we're thinking about kind of values and some of the big concepts out there, kind of trying to turn those into tangible things sometimes can feel a bit overwhelming. So my idea is to make it feel a bit more local, and that can be local in the sense of your kind of your local geography, but also your community and the kind of the networks that you're part of and the teams that you're in. So one of the ways that we kind of break that down is by thinking in terms of lenses. I don't know, some of the designers in here might be used to the idea of kind of looking at sort of journey maps or personas and having different perspectives in things. And one of the ways that we can do that is thinking about the kind of the global values and some of the big kind of concepts and goals that might get talked about in quite strategic ways. And then how those sort of break down into like the national agenda and regional conversations and that sort of thing. And then what we can do kind of, you know, locally day to day, what people are doing in your city, in your communities. This is intentionally a big list of, a list of words. So some of these kind of big concepts that we might be talking about, say the UN Sustainable Development Goals. We've got ESG, we've got Black Lives Matter, we've got climate change, net zero, B Corp, EDI, COVID-19, any number of these kind of big kind of things. And it can be a bit overwhelming to try and take all of that in and figure out what to do with any of it. And to my mind, it can become a bit of what I'm calling acronym soup. So it's all letters and numbers and it stops meaning anything. And so really, at this point, this is sort of where we might sort of try and say, okay, well, rather than being overwhelmed by things, try and hold on to some of those concepts, but pause and reflect and think about really kind of who you are and your kind of place in this sort of ecosystem. So if you sort of take a step back for a moment, think about kind of who you are, and that can be kind of individually, who you are as a person, who you are as a team of people, who you are as an organization, and just kind of take a moment to think about your identity and your personal values and how you fit into the world. And then think, well, what are you actually trying to do? There might be a lot of things going on, and you might feel like you're missing out on a big conversation. But in terms of the tangible kinds of things that you might be able to work through in your role and in your daily life, so just kind of pause and think about kind of what's your mission? Have you got goals? Are there things that you're trying to do? And then also kind of what can you influence? There might be some big things going on that can be quite kind of scary and overwhelming, and things that feel sort of out of your control. And it's worth just sort of taking a moment to think about, okay, well, what's in your sphere of influence? What can you have some level of input in? What conversations can you have? And that type of thing. So really, the point here, just to kind of pause, try not to get overwhelmed by everything, and think, okay, well, who am I and where do I sit in all of this? What am I trying to do? And to my mind, it's all about balance. And one of the big things that I've learned in the past few years, we've faced a lot of challenges in COVID at the start of that. How is this going to affect us, and the kinds of things that we sort of were doing day to day, and how that was affected. And we ended up having a lot of different conversations with people. And one of the kind of the bits of advice that came out that I learned was about starting where you are. There's a tendency to kind of live in perfectionism, or oh, we can't do that because we don't know enough, or we can't do the big thing, so it's not worth doing anything. And what we've found really is that if we start where we are and start small, we can do something and we can build on that. And that's sort of really a way in to this kind of thinking. Years and years ago, I was just, I was more worried about kind of, oh, well, do I know the right code for this? Am I bringing the right sort of skills into this in terms of, like what software I'm using, or, the kind of, the ecosystem in terms of servers or development teams and that sort of side of it. And I was lucky to have a really kind of great mentor sort of early on in my career who felt quite strongly around kind of, accessibility, and around the different things that, you can do to bring your kind of principles into your work. So it's not just the kind of the skill, the job in isolation. It's like you're bringing your personality and your values into that. And from there, the idea then being that if you've got, the kind of the nugget of an idea or a thing to start with, you can build on that knowledge, you can research, you can try things out, and then over time, I'm pretty sure most people in this room are familiar with the idea of sprints and iteration and that sort of idea. So it's kind of, it's not necessarily thinking too or getting too caught up in the idea of, what the destination is. It's sort of how you approach some of these things on a day-to-day level, how you're working through, how you make progress. And, some of that will be research, some of it will be experience, and you don't want to get too lost in either world. And then as you're building your experience, your knowledge, start to sort of try and build influence. So in terms of your networks, if you work in a team, if you're trying to kind of bring some values in, but the idea is or the kind of the pushback sometimes might be, oh well, that's all well and good, but that's not our job to do that. It's kind of looking for ways that you can get something in as a starting point to sort of build on those kinds of relationships and those ideas, and so build influence, build your network, find out where your allies are, and get involved in kind of various kind of groups or things. If you don't have those things in your team or at work, find the places where you can kind of connect with people and build that influence. And then the final point is to do what you can. Sometimes there are things that are out of your control, and it's easy to get demotivated by that. And I think it's very important to just to take a minute and don't be too hard on yourself and think, okay, we can start somewhere and we can build on that, and that's enough for today. That's progress. And one of the ways that we can help kind of steer that progress and sort of build that team alignment is, in my mind, through choosing a direction. And one of the reasons why I find this so important is because it helps to align people, both into, and it gives you clarity. So in terms of your kind of, if you have a sense of direction, you can figure out your goals, your aims, but you can also kind of get people on board. And so you might have a team that you work with, it might be other organizations that you work with, and if you have that shared sense of direction and aims, then you've got the collaboration there, you've got some sort of sense of being able to build things and move along and perhaps do something that's a bit greater than perhaps your individual sort of sphere of influence. And one of the ways that we have looked at that kind of idea, how we kind of build direction, how we build kind of sort of sympathetic relationships with other organizations, is looking at kind of some of the guidance and the frameworks that are out there. And so I've sort of framed this talk in terms of what the global kind of picture is, but then how you can kind of turn that into something tangible and that feels real to people. And there's this concept of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Is anyone familiar with that term? I've got a handful of people. It's great to see that. But the one of the sort of things within that is it's basically kind of looking at kind of things that say, NGOs, sort of government organizations, countries, big kind of concepts that kind of help kind of move the global agenda sort of forward. And then we've got things like B Corp and impact assessments. Is anyone familiar with B Corp? Oh, we've got a few. And so that can help kind of place things from a global perspective and start to make it that bit more tangible in terms of kind of, say, how you might kind of build a business with sort of ethics and values as part of the framework there. And then, does anybody here work within the NHS? We got one person there, great. Oh, some more. And there's this, you may well have come across this idea of the NHS Core 20+5, and this is like a framework for kind of addressing health inequalities and that sort of idea. And then the other thing that we look at is kind of regional policies. So, what are the kinds of things that are affecting the local communities that we're in? If people are sort of acting strategically in the region, in the local area, what are the regional policies that are in place to kind of gain that kind of alignment, that collaboration, and that sort of sense of shared progress and aims. I'm just going to very quickly touch on the Sustainable Development Goals. If you haven't seen them, there are 17 of them, so there's a lot. And to my mind, that's overwhelming, and there's no way on earth I can hold 17 goals in my mind. So, to be honest with you, we don't really try to sort of do that. What we've done, and this goes back to that point that I made earlier about sort of being able to pause and reflect on what you're trying to do. We've looked at those Sustainable Development Goals and said, okay, well, what are the ones that are most relevant to us? What are the things that we can influence, what's our kind of, our remit with our, our business, what are we trying to do, and what can we influence. And so we came up with kind of 3 primary goals that kind of align with those sustainable development goals. So in terms of our world, because we do a lot in terms of, comms, working with teams, working with identity, working with business transformation. So we've got sort of decent work in economic growth, and that feels like a very tangible thing that we can work with in our business. Reduced inequalities from a personal level, it's very much kind of how Ruth and I set up the business in terms of what we wanted to address and the values that we were bringing into this. And with being what we term a purpose-driven business, we're working with other organizations that have some sense of shared purpose. So we're often working with organizations who are trying to reduce inequalities. And so again, that feels like a very, very tangible thing. And then because of the kind of people we are and the work that we do, we're often sort of networking, putting on events and doing that kind of thing. And in terms of our values, we're very much kind of focused on the idea of, collaboration. We don't know everything, and we're not experts in everything. So if we can find ways to kind of work together with people, we've got that sort of sense of partnership for the goals, and we can advocate for kind of principles and moving the agenda on. And then we have some sort of secondary goals that we sort of picked out, which, are not our primary goals and probably don't have kind of as much direct influence on, but they're kind of principles that we might be able to apply in situations. So say, for instance, if we're looking at running a workshop, we want to make sure that we've got a good set of stakeholders across sort of, various kind of audiences, thinking about kind of who are the people in the room, who has the voice in the room, so it's not just kind of, oh, well, this is a bunch of developers sitting there sort of talking to each other. It's kind of people from, all walks of life who, ultimately understanding who the audiences are and what we're trying to do. It might well be things, so we've got sustainable cities and communities there, and one of the ways that you can look at that is around kind of, well, where do we run events? What's the transport like? Can we help people kind of get to places? Can we make things walkable? Are we using local independent venues and that sort of thing? And then the final point around responsible consumption and production. So even down to like the catering for an event, for instance, we can sort of source local suppliers and think about things like, okay, well, what's the carbon footprint of us putting on this event? Can we kind of look at, say, using vegan options for the catering and kind of the impact that can have, sort of positively or reducing our sort of negative impact in that sort of side of things. And then moving sort of into this B Corp kind of world, does anyone have any direct experience of kind of trying to go through a B Corp impact assessment? Yeah, how was that for you? Yeah. It's an arduous process. It's unpleasant, and it's very different for different organizations. There's a side of it that's great. It's very robust, but it can be a bit of a process to go through. But the way that we've kind of found helpful to get through that is to get support. There are people out there who are, more experienced than we are, who've helped steer us through that. We wouldn't have got through it without their help. And then kind of thinking it like, well, what are the principles? So say governance there, we're talking about things like policies and mission and processes. And so, what are we doing to kind of be, ethical? What are we doing to look after people? What are we doing to kind of try and embed those values in every step of what we're doing? So in terms of just trying to place that in terms of, say, design systems, it's kind of, you can have technical infrastructure for a design system, but, what are you doing to kind of bring in and sort of create those robust processes to make sure that you're, responsibly sort of taking care of people and addressing people's needs, particularly sort of, if you think about if you work in the government digital service and you've got a kind of a remit to serve the community, making sure that those people are present and not just kind of paying lip service to it, to invite them to, a stakeholder meeting or something like that. Who are the leaders, who are the developers, who are, the people involved in kind of steering the ship there. I won't go through it in all, too much detail for all of these, but, it's basically these areas that you can look at and you can kind of think, okay, well, what are we doing for our staff? What are the ways that we can help manage stress? What do we have in place around sort of well-being? Are we paying people a living wage? All of those kinds of ideas. And then things like community can feel a little bit intangible sometimes, and one of the things that we have is we started doing, it's, effectively a networking program, but it's sort of cross-sector and thinking about, well, what if our kind of way of engaging with the community isn't about what we can sell people or what we can get people to buy. It's, how can we work together with people? What are our shared values? What are the big issues? What don't we know about that we should know about that we can help kind of, if we can facilitate a conversation and kind of try and get, because we work in cross-sector ways, sometimes we find the most surprising kind of thing about some of our events or our workshops and that kind of thing is that people don't talk to each other. You might have kind of some public sector sort of organizations who just operate in quite an insular way. And within the community, they might not feel like there's a direct route to speaking to the local authority or, and so there can be this sort of disconnect between people in those sectors. And so what we try to do is kind of get people in the room and sometimes have quite challenging conversations and try and move that forward and try and learn from each other. At the start of this, there was a point on the thing about, a code of conduct for the day and, being respectful. And I think those kind of principles sort of, come through. If my clicker works. Again, I'm only sort of referencing these just to kind of give you a bit of a sense of the kinds of kind of frameworks or a way to kind of place some of these concepts. So if you've worked with the NHS, in the past few years, you might have come across this concept, and it's looking at kind of say reducing health inequalities. So the principle here is looking at, okay, well, who are the most deprived 20% of the population? And what can we do to sort of address their health inequalities? And then the plus part is very much kind of, okay, are there things that don't sort of fit neatly into that kind of category that are important for us to consider? And then the 5 is looking at kind of effectively topic areas, health areas. So here we've got maternity, severe mental illness, respiratory disease, cancer, and then on here it says hypertension case finding, but it's basically like what we can do about heart attack and stroke and that kind of thing. And Liverpool has the somewhat dubious honor of being a prime location for all of those things. And so what we've got here is, on one hand, there's, obviously something that's quite kind of potentially sort of depressing and demoralizing about that. What is the reason for that in the region? But then there's also an opportunity, and we've been fortunate enough to work with a couple of organizations across the Liverpool City region. And as an example, we've got Liverpool Health Partners, and so they're in a prime location based in Liverpool to look at all of these kinds of things and say, okay, well, if these are the health inequalities that we're trying to address, we've got people here. What can we do? What can we do on the ground to kind of help move that conversation along? And that they're an organization that is set up to kind of pull together like research and funding and try to make sure that kind of things happen in a sort of strategic and kind of directed way that kind of helps move on that sort of health conversation. The Civic Data Cooperative, they work with the Combined Authority and the universities, and it's very much around sort of health data, and it's looking at kind of being stewards for, what people do with data. We've got a lot of fear sort of around privacy and what happens with data and what happens with kind of, you might think of, Meta, Facebook, Google, whoever, what are they doing with data? And then what are companies trying to do to sort of leverage that? And Civic Data Cooperative, their remit is to work with local organizations, sort of health organizations, research institutions, community organizations, and commercial businesses to try and say, okay, well, there's an opportunity here. We need to be careful with it, but how do we sort of steward that conversation? And so they're kind of bringing in values into the way they build out services, and so the principles of kind of how they might kind of look at, okay, well, if we've got all this digital data, what's happening with it? How are we making sure that it's kind of, it's carefully managed? And then just trying to bring this back round to the city region. So in Liverpool, we've got the kind of the broader sort of Liverpool city region, which is made of the six borough councils here, and effectively anything that happens in that kind of quite big strategic way, if you hear anything happening with the Metro Mayor, it's usually these kind of big concepts that are these kind of borough councils sort of working together on some of the kind of the big things, the big values. And their current kind of plan is innovating for growth and looking at kind of what that means in sort of different areas. So, they want Liverpool to be the best place to grow up, best place to grow a family, and the best place to grow a business. And in our world, probably the area that we can influence things the most is in terms of growing a business and how you can bring those values and principles in. And so there's this idea of fairness, and we've got a clear sense of the kinds of areas that they're looking at. So they're looking at transport, they're looking at place. What does the community mean, both in terms of values post-COVID, but also in terms of, okay, well, the city centres are kind of struggling in retail and all of that sort of thing. So, kind of what's going on to make sure that as a place, as a community, Liverpool is vibrant and serving the people who live there. I'm sure you're very familiar with accessibility sort of principles here. But the idea, as we sort of talked about some of those health inequalities, within Liverpool, we have a couple of different sort of organisations. There's sort of Dada Fest, who does a lot with kind of disability in art, but they also sort of advocate for better sort of representation in services within business. And one of the interesting things that they're doing at the moment is looking at, say, okay, well, maybe it might feel like a big task to kind of incorporate British Sign Language into your digital services. How do you bring that into your design systems? And one of the ways that they've looked at doing that is by giving kind of overview videos and not getting too caught up in kind of every minute detail, but thinking about, okay, well, what's the experience? What can you do to sort of set the scene? And that sort of idea. So the idea of like bringing those values into something that might feel like sometimes like a technical kind of aspect of what you're doing. So I've been through a lot of things there. That was intentional. And the thing with that is there's so much that you could do. And the important thing really is to think back to kind of that idea of who you are, what you're trying to do, and set goals that feel kind of relevant and tangible for you. And the way that we do that is through SMART goals and trying to break it down. So here, for instance, we've got kind of 17 goals is way too much. Can you kind of break that down into kind of 3 to 5 kind of big ideas, and can you make them real? So the idea of like them being kind of, specific, measurable, relevant. And one of the ways that we make things relevant is thinking about those kind of frameworks and those national conversations. So the idea of kind of, does this align with the framework? Are there things going on here where we know that this is part of the agenda? So their goals are our goals, and anything that we're working through is very much kind of that sense of shared aims, and then effectively we've got a larger collaborative team. It's not just us trying to do a thing, it's multiple organizations across the region who are trying to do things and try and make some progress. And then really the only way to sort of get through and make progress is to plant some seeds and nurture them. So the idea of kind of growth and starting where you are and sort of building those kind of things up. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. But basically, going back to that idea of how do you kind of take this kind of global concept, think, okay, well, what is that agenda? What are these big values that we're talking about? How can we kind of place those in terms of, the national conversation, what's happening, it might be a government policy level and that sort of side of thing that might kind of influence the digital services that we're charged with kind of creating. And then what's going on in the regional and local agenda, both in terms of the kind of the strategy, but also the sort of tangible, on the ground things that people are doing every day. And that's kind of me, really. So it's that principle there: start small, grow stronger, grow together. And I'll leave you with that. But hopefully I've covered some of these kind of things, some tangible examples, some sense of the real world experiences in Liverpool, and some practical advice for kind of how you might tackle some of these things and turn them into tangible goals. And then hopefully I'll see you soon. I've got a couple of events on the horizon. One tonight in Liverpool, if anyone's interested in sustainability. And then I've got, as part of this, I'm doing a follow-up talk on this conversation as part of the Global Goals Week. So that QR code is for the Global Goals Week event. And then that's me. If you want to connect. I'll be very happy to hear from you. So thank you very much.